Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So over the weekend I participated in another webcam event. This time it was the Welcome to Primary Village event, where it was basically just a YouTuber invite tournament where I just played with a whole bunch of different Digimon YouTubers, all to try to support and help a lot of the smaller channels and just kind of promote good health within the YouTube community for all of the Digimon TCG YouTubers. So that was really fun to be a part of, and unfortunately I didn't exactly win, but 7th place isn't too bad considering the deck that I was running wasn't exactly Blue Omnimon. I did go up against Blue Omnimon, quite a lot of them, but I felt like the deck that I took was definitely a really strong and really powerful deck that definitely could beat out a lot of the other decks if played and managed correctly. So the deck that I ended up taking was a green deck. So I don't really want to call this a Rosemon control deck or a Titamon aggro deck. It was kind of like a hybrid of both. But like the whole point and objective of the deck was to basically just have your Titamon and or Rosemon on the field with an Okuwamon and or Lillymon on the field, and basically just try to control and manipulate the opponent's board, so that way it makes it very, very hard for them to play their Digimon, because otherwise we're just going to end up beating it up, and that's kind of the big theme of the deck, is just beat up the opponent's Digimon so they don't have anything, and then we are just basically safe to aggress onto their security because they don't have anything on the field to stop us. So the deck is definitely a very, very powerful deck, and it is a very, very complicated deck, and it's just a really good time if you know how to play it. So going over the deck really quickly, I'm running 3 copies of Tanemon because the DP buff on Tanemon is pretty easy to play, on top of which we do need the DP buff for a lot of our megas, because that's how we beat up into the opponent's megas, is making ours stronger than theirs. And then Frimon is basically doing the same role as Tanemon. It's just the requirements and conditions are a little bit different. It's a little bit harder to meet, but against certain decks, it isn't impossible. And definitely, again, the DP boost does come in handy more often than it doesn't. Next, on to the rookies, I'm running 4 copies of Goblimon. So Goblimon is just the value-efficient vanilla rookie because, you know, cheap to play, cheap to evolve just means it's a good card. Next, I'm running 4 copies of Tentomon. So Tentomon is in here just because he has a really nice inheritable ability of when attacking, we get to suspend one of our opponent's Digimon with 3000 DP or less. So if the opponent is trying to build a small go wide strategy, then Tentomon definitely helps us rest a lot of their Digimon, so that way we could then use our Digimon to pick them all off. Next, I'm running 2 copies of Palmon. So I'm not super thrilled with Palmon, but compared to everything else that Green has as far as rookies that we're not playing, Palmon is just the lesser of the evils. Most of the time I end up playing Palmon for its evo cost, just because it is 0 to evolve versus the other rookies that we have that cost 1 to evolve. And I did test around with the rookies that cost 1, and it just felt very, very bad. And yeah, Palmon just being another rookie that costs 0 is nice. On top of which, the on-play ability could be pretty decent. Most of the time, I just ended up never wanting to do it, and I just Digivolved her instead. But the on-play ability, being able to check the top 3 for a level 4 Digimon, does come in handy a couple of times and is still a pretty nice ability to have. But again, most of the time I wanted to play with the cards on top and I didn't want to try to dig, so I just ended up Digivolving more than playing her. And then the last rookie of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Agumon, so this is probably the most important rookie in the whole deck, just because his inheritable ability just is a good DP boost. So again, this is just how we are able to beat up onto the opponent's Digimon, and being able to DP boost is definitely a very important thing that we want to be doing. Next, on to the champions, I ran 4 copies of Vegiemon. So Vegiemon is a pretty powerful Digimon just because he is just a very powerfully statted vanilla card. So he's very, very cheap to Digivolve into. For a champion, he's relatively cheap to play. And then on top of all that, he even has 6000 DP, which is just really, really powerful because he is the main champion that we are going to be using to be aggressing with, and the others that we're using for more defensive or evolution purposes. Next, I ran 4 copies of Woodmon. So Woodmon is the champion that has blocker for the deck. So he just helps us stave off some early game aggression while we try to build up our Digimon and get into our Megas. So that way we could use our Megas as potently and powerfully as we possibly can. So having a blocker just helps us buy some time till we get there. And then the last champion of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Kabuterimon. So Kabuterimon is a pretty powerful Digimon just because his inheritable ability is doing something very, very similar to Agumon's. So if the opponent has more rested Digimon, then they get more of a DP boost. On top of that, Kabuterimon also has an evo cost of 1, which again is just pretty powerful, but we're mainly looking for the DP boost just so our Megas can be as efficient as they possibly can. Next, on to the Ultimates. I ran 3 copies of Okuwamon. So Okuwamon is an absolutely insane ultimate considering it has a very, very low evo cost compared to a lot of other ultimates. And then on top of which, the inheritable ability is just really, really nice, where when one of our Digimon deletes an opponent's Digimon by battle and survives, then we gain 1 memory. So this is the card we want to be utilizing on whatever Mega we're going to be aggressing with onto the opponent's Digimon. So that way we at least get some benefit out of aggressing onto the opponent's Digimon. And then the other important ultimate of the deck is 3 copies of Lillymon. So Lillymon is another really clutch ultimate just because she helps us form a very powerful and very dominating board state on our Megas because of her inheritable ability, where when attacking we get to suspend one of the opponent's Digimon without blocker. And then she has a very low evo cost also, so it makes her also another very efficient card to Digivolve with. And then the last ultimate is 2 copies of Cherrymon. So Cherrymon, again, has another low evo cost compared to a lot of other ultimates. And then on top of which, Cherrymon also has blocker. So if we need to Digivolve up into another blocker to help stave off some damage, then just having more instances of blocker is just a very good thing to have. On top of which, the fact that he has 7,000 DP does come in handy. So you could use Cherrymon with a couple of DP boosts to just try to aggress into the opponent's Digimon if you don't feel like you need the blocker, and that's just really, really powerful to think about because as a blocker, he just doesn't have any downsides to attacking other than the fact that he won't be able to defend. But if the opponent is losing their Digimon, then you don't necessarily care because they're not going to have anything to attack with anyway. Next, on to the Megas. I ran 3 copies of Titamon. So Titamon is just a very, very powerful Mega just because he has a very low evo cost, on top of which he has some very high DP. So this makes him the absolute perfect card to try to aggress onto the opponent with, whether we're using him to hit the opponent's security or using him to hit into the opponent's Digimon. It doesn't really matter. The fact that he just is a very good card that we could play relatively quickly just makes him very, very powerful. Next, I ran 3 copies of Rosemon. So I wasn't super thrilled with Rosemon. I still am not entirely sold on the card. It's a okay card, but considering the lack of options, it just was, again, one of those lesser of the evil kind of cards where it's just like, okay, Rosemon just is okay compared to some of the other options. So Rosemon is a very averagely statted Mega, and what you're really looking to gain out of the card is its innate ability, where during the opponent's turn, when the opponent has a Digimon that attacks a player, if this Digimon is suspended, then we get to suspend one of the opponent's Digimon down. So this really punishes the opponent and really limits the amount of aggression that they are allowed to take if we have Rosemon in a rested position. And that's just really, really good because it allows us to control and manipulate the board while trying to limit the amount of damage that the opponent can do to us. So Rosemon is just a very powerful card just for that little bit of control aspect to the card, and then it plays along with some of our other cards like Frimon, where we could get Frimon's buff a little bit easier with Rosemon, and Rosemon's just, again, a very solid Mega overall. And then the last Mega of the deck that I ran was 2 copies of Puppetmon. So Puppetmon is a pretty interesting card because most of the time we want to play it for its on-play ability, to just suspend one of the opponent's Digimon down and then basically stun lock them so they can't unsuspend any of their Digimon during their unsuspend phase. So this is just what we use to keep things rested in case they're trying to aggress too hard, and we use this card to buy us some extra time. On top of which, he has a nice when attacking ability where we could gain 1 memory. So if we choose to Digivolve up into him, then we could utilize that ability a little bit more efficiently than if we were to just Brawl play him. But overall, Puppetmon's just a very fantastic card at just trying to, again, control and manipulate the opponent's board. Next, on to the options, I ran 4 copies of Flower Cannon. So Flower Cannon's pretty decent because it's a very cost-efficient option card, on top of which its main ability to suspend one of the opponent's Digimon is very, very powerful, because we could use this to rest a blocker down to bypass the blocker, or we could use this to rest the blocker to beat up the blocker. We could use this to rest another Digimon down just to try to beat up into it, and that's just really, really powerful. On top of which, it has good synergy with Frimon, trying to set up Frimon's buff and help Kabutarimon's buff even more. So it's just a very, very powerful card, on top of which its security effect, being able to suspend all of the opponent's Digimon without blocker down, is just very, very powerful, because if they're trying to aggress into us too hard and they have a whole bunch of Digimon on the field, then Flower Cannon just rests all of them and helps us live a little bit longer. But I wasn't super thrilled with the overall performance of Flower Cannon. I found that 4 Flower Cannons ended up bricking my hand more often than I wanted to play it, and that was like the only real unfortunate thing about the card. Is it's really, really good, but you don't want to see it too much, because like then it just clogs your hand, and then you don't really want to play it because you don't have any good targets, or you don't have any good Digimon to attack with. So it just became more awkward, especially depending on how the opponent was playing. So it's a solid card. It's just, I think 4 is a little bit too much. And then the last option card I was running was 2 copies of Terrace Cluster. So this card is actually a really clutch card. Like, this card came in so handy in so many situations that it was just absolutely insane. I think this card is pretty underrated, and this is just another very fantastic removal option for green. Its main ability is being able to return one of the opponent's suspended Digimon to the bottom of the deck, and then trash all of their evolution sources. So this is the card that allows us to basically just deal with the cards that we can't deal with ordinarily. Yes, they do have to be suspended, but most of the time we have ways of suspending them, or they're going to end up in a suspended state. So that way we could use Terrace Cluster to just, again, control the opponent's board and get rid of problems that we can't deal with otherwise. And then the fact that its security ability is also activating its main ability just is really, really powerful, because if they're attacking into our security and this is revealed, 9 out of 10 times, the attacking Digimon is going to be suspended, so that just makes Terrace Cluster even better when in the security, because it's basically just doing everything Gaia Force is doing. So if I were to change the deck, I would up Terrace Cluster to 3 and lower Flower Cannon to 3. And then the last card of the deck, which is going to be the only tamer of the deck, and that is 2 copies of Mimi. So Mimi is just a very good card just because she's the memory fixing tamer. And then on top of that, she helps give us another raising phase if we have a green level 5 or higher Digimon in play. Most of the time we are going to have one of those. So just being able to turbo out our raising area just could apply a whole bunch of additional pressure onto the opponent that they might not be able to deal with. On top of which, just getting more Digimon out means that we could draw more cards, so she helps with card draw a little bit, and she's just overall a very fantastic card. But being a 4-cost memory fixing tamer, she is really hard to play sometimes, so the later the game goes, the harder it is to play her. So that's just one of the big reasons why we're only running 2 of her, is so that she doesn't try to clog up her hand, and we really only need 1 Mimi on the field to be very, very effective. So for the most part, this is just the deck that I ran. It is a very, very complicated deck where the whole idea is to just have Titamon and Rosemon out, and then have one of them have Lillymon and the other to have Okuwamon. So you kind of create like this weird soft lock onto the opponent where it's like one Mega attacks, rests the other Digimon down, and then the other Mega will attack the rested Digimon down, and that just makes it very, very hard for the opponent to just have Digimon on the field, because you're constantly going to be pressuring their security with one and beating up the Digimon with the other. And that's just kind of why Okuwamon and Lillymon are very, very important for the deck. And building a proper stack with the proper buffs just make your megas function even better than they normally would. So it all just feeds into each other on having a really, really powerful evolution stack and having as many megas on field with good stacks on the field, so that way you could utilize the megas to their utmost potential. But again, it can sometimes be very, very hard to get to those states, and sometimes your stacks are going to be awkward. And getting into those awkward positions, that definitely is a huge deterrent for the deck, just because it's like, okay, if you can't properly build your megas, then your megas just won't function properly, and your game plan is going to be a lot harder, which makes your win con a lot harder. So it is a more skill-intensive deck to play, but it is a very, very powerful deck to play when played correctly. So in terms of one of the big changes that I would make to the deck, had I known I'd be going up against so many blue Omnimons, I would definitely have teched in Vegiemon, because I think Vegiemon in 1.0 is one of the best techs against the blue Omnimon, just because he is a large body with blocker, so he could block a whole bunch of different Digimon down, on top of which, because you are playing a slightly more control style deck, just having an extra blocker is never a bad thing. And then what you're really playing him for is he has a powerful on-play ability to just de-digivolve 2 of the opponent's Digimon down. So this is what you could use to also try to clear out Omnimons, and because you could probably guess that the opponent's going to be playing Omnimon, then this card just becomes very, very useful, because he will almost always be playable if the opponent's playing Omnimon, because, you know, they're just going to give you a whole bunch of memory to play around with for digivolving or playing awkward plays into some of their other Digimon. So Vegiemon is just a very clutch card that I wish I had in my deck for this event, and I think I would have done way better had I ran Vegiemon against all of the blue Omnimon decks. But in terms of how my matchups went, I unfortunately was unlucky enough to get all of the blue Omnimon players. There wasn't a whole lot of blue Omnimon players, but again, I was just unlucky enough to see all of them. My round 1, I got a bye because my opponent didn't show up. Then in round 2, I faced off against a blue Omnimon deck, and I won 2-0, just because I was able to control their board so they couldn't get to their Omnimon, and if they can't get to their Omnimon, then their Omnimon's basically a dead card in their hand, and if they try to overextend by raw playing some of their other cards, then that just gives me a whole bunch of memory to work with to just be able to beat out whatever they're planning and to beat out their board state, so that way I just easily win the game. And then round 3 was against another blue Omnimon, and again, second verse, same as the first, I was just able to beat them up. Unfortunately, I did end up losing one of the games, but that's just because I was unable to control the board or deal with their Omnimon. And then going into round 4, I ended up losing against a blue Omnimon. This was on stream, and it was a very good game. I ended up winning one game against the blue Omnimon, but they won the other 2 games. But again, that was just me off of my game plan, and when my game plan becomes off and awkward, then the deck becomes a lot harder to win with. But when the deck is on its game plan, then it's very hard for the opponent to win against it. But in this style of deck, my whole objective is trying to control the board and make sure they don't have any Digimon on the field, so that way they cannot play their Omnimon. And if they do play their Omnimon, then I have to try to find ways to deal with it, and Terrace Cluster definitely is a very clutch card to help deal with their Omnimon. And then going into my last game, and then going into my last round, which was round 5, I faced the last blue Omnimon player in the event, and I unfortunately lost it 2-0, and I kind of bubbled where, again, the blue Omnimon player was just able to play their Omnimon, and they were able to gain so much advantage in tempo, and I was slightly off on my game plan, so it just didn't line up, and I ended up losing both games. But the fact that this deck was able to take a whole bunch of games off of blue Omnimon decks is very, very something noteworthy, just because, again, if played and when played correctly, this deck is just a very, very powerful deck that could probably beat out almost anything in the meta, and it's just a very, very powerful deck when played correctly. But I had a ton of fun during the event, and it was just really fun to be a part of, even though I got 7th place. 7th place isn't that bad out of, 30 players, so that wasn't terrible. And as the only green player, it definitely shows how good green could be. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. And I'll see you in the next video.